Captain John Stovall heard the diesel engines before he could see anything at all. His tanks sat on a bald red mountain in the Western Highlands near the place where three countries met in the dark. He had 4 of those tanks, a ring of barbed wire, and an order that came down to something very simple. Hold this hill or watch the whole border open up behind you. The North Vietnamese armor was already moving through the tree line that night. A little more than a year earlier, enemy tanks had smashed into a special forces camp not far away and wiped it off the map. And ever since, every man on the border knew that armor was the one thing these hilltop outposts could not stop. The air smelled of cordite and wet laterite clay. The crews had loaded their guns in a hurry. Spent shell casings were already rolling under their boots. It was the night of March 3rd, 1969. The first warning had come, as engine noise in the dark, a low grinding of tracks somewhere out past the wire, and then nothing. Berets sat only a few kilometers from the place where South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all touched, and the last friendly ground for many miles was the hill under Stovall's feet. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. Cold War Impact is a small history channel, and lately our views have slipped more than we would like. If you enjoy careful, well-sourced history like this, please think about subscribing, dropping a comment, and sharing the video. Every single click helps the channel reach new people, and it lets me keep making these long-form documentaries. Now, back to that hill, in the Highlands. For more than a year, the threat of North Vietnamese armor had hung over the border like a held breath. The enemy had tanks, and the American Special Forces camps that guarded the frontier did not. The one-time Soviet-built armor had come grinding out of the dark against an American-held camp. The Green Berets and their Highland fighters had met it with rifles, with light rockets fired from the shoulder, and with raw courage. None of that had been enough. Steel beat flesh, and the camp was lost. In the entire Vietnam War, American crude tanks fought enemy tanks in a stand-up battle exactly once. That night was at Ben Het. Everything before, it was a story of men with no answer to the machines coming for them. The weapon that finally broke that grip was not a new missile. It was not a secret aircraft or a wonder gun flown in from a laboratory. It was a medium tank that the American Army had been using since the 1950s. A tank that almost nobody thought to send into the Highlands until it was very nearly too late. To understand how 4 of those tanks shattered more than a year of fear in a single night, we have to go back to a different camp on a different border, on a freezing night in early 1968, when the United States learned in the worst possible way that it had brought rifles to a tank fight. What nobody in the American command had fully accepted yet was that the answer to the enemy's tanks was already in the country. It was sitting in motor pools and on flat cars, hundreds of these machines, and for more than a year, almost none of them had been pushed forward to the border camps that needed them most. The reason was a belief, quiet and stubborn, that tanks simply did not belong in the jungle. The mountain camps along the frontier were not built to win battles. They were built to watch. The American Special Forces called them border surveillance camps, and each one was a cluster of bunkers and wire perched on high ground, manned by a small team of Green Berets and a few hundred local Highland fighters, the Americans called the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. Their job was to sit on the infiltration routes that branched off the Great Supply Network. The North Vietnamese ran through Laos and Cambodia to count what came down those trails and to call in fire when they could. These were lonely outposts. A camp might hold a dozen Americans and 300 or 400 Highland soldiers, far from any town, supplied mostly by air, surrounded by triple canopy jungle that hid anything until it was close. For years, that arrangement worked well enough, because the enemy who came down the trails came on foot. Then, in the winter of 1968, the enemy brought tracks. It helps to understand what those trails actually were, because they are the reason any of this happened. The North Vietnamese moved men and weapons south through a vast web of paths, roads and river crossings that ran through the supposedly neutral territory of Laos and Cambodia. It was not a single road, but a living, shifting network, repaired faster than it could be bombed, threaded through some of the most punishing terrain in Asia. Where that network spilled across the border into the central highlands of South Vietnam, the Americans planted their watch posts. The highlands were the hinge of the whole country, a spine of mountains and plateaus that, if the enemy seized it, could split South Vietnam in two and open the road to the coast. Whoever held the high ground here held a knife against the heart of the country. That is why both sides cared so much about a few bare hills that most of the world had never heard of. 4. The North Vietnamese, the border camps, were an irritation, a set of eyes and a set of guns sitting astride the routes they needed. For the Americans and their allies, those same camps were tripwires, early warning, and a way to make the enemy bleed for every mile of trail. The men who held them lived a strange and dangerous life, half soldier and half frontier scout, building rapport with the highland tribes who made up the bulk of the garrisons, patrolling ground where the enemy might be 100 miles away or 100 yards away, and never quite knowing which. The place where it went wrong was called Lang Vai. It sat in the far northwest, near the Laotian border, not far from the Marine base at Khe Sanh. On the night of February 6, 1968, in the middle of the great offensive that was tearing across South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese sent armor against an American-held position for the first time in the war. The defenders of Lang Vai were a special forces team, and their Highland strikers, a few hundred fighters dug into bunkers. They heard the engines in the dark, just as Stovall's men would hear them a year later. Then, the tanks came through the wire. They were PT-76s, light Soviet amphibious machines, and against a camp with no armor of its own, they were nearly unstoppable. The defenders fought them with what they had. They fired light anti-tank rockets, the kind a single soldier carried and fired from the shoulder. They fired heavier, recoilless rifles. They scored hits. They even knocked out several of the tanks. It was not enough. The armor ground over the bunkers and crushed the defense from within. By the time the night was over, Lang Vai had fallen. Most of the Americans were dead, wounded, or captured. The Highland fighters were scattered and slaughtered. A few survivors crawled out through the jungle toward Khe Sanh. The lesson was carved into the record in blood. A border camp without tanks of its own could not stop tanks. Courage did not matter. Skill did not matter. The men at Lang Vai had both, and the steel rolled over them anyway. That defeat should have changed everything overnight. It did not. The North Vietnamese had shown their hand, and they had shown it clearly. Yet the American answer, the thing that could have turned the next tank attack into a slaughter going the other way, stayed parked far from the border. To understand why, you have to understand the machine itself and the prejudice that kept it out of the fight. The tank the enemy used at Lang Vai was the PT-76. It was a Soviet design, and it was built for speed and water, not for slugging matches. It weighed only about 14 tons. Its armor was thin, in places no more than half an inch of steel, because every pound of weight was sacrificed to keep the thing light enough to swim across rivers. Under its own power, it carried a 76mm gun and a crew of 3. In its proper role, scouting ahead of an army, splashing across waterways, supporting infantry, it was a clever and useful machine. In a straight fight against a heavier tank, it was a coffin with tracks. The Americans had exactly the heavier tank that could kill it. The trouble was getting anyone to send it. The machine was the M48 Patton. It was a medium tank, a battle tank, weighing close to 50 tons, more than 3 times the heft of the PT-76. Its hull and turret were thick cast steel. The frontal armor measured in inches rather than fractions of an inch. It carried a 90mm gun that could punch clean through the thin skin of a light tank at a range where the lighter gun could barely scratch it. The version in Vietnam, the M48A3, ran on a diesel engine, which meant it was far less likely to burst into flame than the old gasoline models. It carried infrared searchlights and night sights, so its crews could find targets in the dark. The Patton was not a new design even then. It traced its lineage back to the years just after the Second World War, named for the famous American armored commander, built and rebuilt through the 1950s as the backbone of American tank forces. The diesel engine was a crucial improvement. Earlier, Pattons had run on gasoline, and a gasoline tank that took a penetrating hit could become a furnace in seconds, killing its crew before they could escape. The switch to diesel did not make the tank invulnerable, but it made it far harder to set ablaze. and it gave the machine the range to operate far from its fuel supply. In a place like the Highlands, where everything had to be hauled up bad roads or flown in, that endurance mattered. The Patton was, in short, a mature and well-understood weapon, exactly the kind of dependable machine a border camp needed. It was not exotic, it was simply absent from the places it was needed most. On paper, the matchup was not close. It was a massacre waiting to happen if only the heavier tank were present when the lighter ones attacked. The 90mm gun against 14mm of armor was not a duel, it was an execution. Yet for month after month, the Patton was kept away from exactly the places where the enemy armor was most likely to appear. The reason was doctrine, and doctrine is just a fancy word for what an army believes in its bones. The American command believed that Vietnam was not tank country. The maps showed jungle, mountains, flooded paddies, and soft ground that could swallow a 50-ton vehicle whole. Senior officers had been taught that armor needed open ground to maneuver. The rolling fields of Europe, the deserts of North Africa, not the choked green hills of Southeast Asia. So the tanks that did come to Vietnam were often used in ways that hid their strength, scattered in small packets, parked as static pillboxes, kept off the very border where they might have done the most good. There was a bitter irony buried in all of this. The enemy, who was supposed to be the lightly armed guerrilla force, had been willing to drag tanks hundreds of miles down jungle trails to use them. The Americans, who had the better tanks, by far had largely talked themselves out of bringing them to the fight. For more than a year after Lang Vei, that gap stayed open. The next time the engines growled in the dark, it could have been another massacre. It would be unfair to paint the men who held that belief as fools. They were not. The terrain truly was difficult, and tanks truly did bog down in soft ground and lose their way in dense jungle where they could not see 50 feet ahead. There were real reasons. Armor was hard to use in Vietnam, and many an American tank had been swallowed by mud or ambushed on a narrow trail. But there is a difference between a hard problem and an impossible one. The lesson the army was slow to absorb was not that tanks belonged everywhere, but that where the enemy chose to use armor, the answer had to be armor of equal or greater weight, ready and waiting. Lang Vei had spelled out exactly where the enemy would strike: the isolated border camps near the trail network. The map of the danger was already drawn. What remained was to put the heavier tank on the threatened hills before the enemy arrived, and for more than a year, that simple step was not taken. By the start of 1969, the place where the next blow would land was already taking shape, and its name was Ben Het. The camp sat in the western part of Con Tum province, in the central highlands, on high ground that looked out over the tangle of borders where the trail system spilled into South Vietnam. It was the westernmost outpost in a chain of camps, the one closest to the enemy's sanctuaries across the line. From its hill, American heavy artillery could reach far into the no-man's land beyond the frontier, shelling the trails and the staging areas the North Vietnamese used to move men and supplies south. That artillery made Ben Het a target. The camp held a battery of long-barreled 175mm self-propelled guns, enormous weapons that could throw a shell more than 20 miles. To the North Vietnamese, those guns were a knife held against the throat of their supply line. Silencing them was worth a great deal. It was worth risking the one thing the enemy normally guarded so carefully in the highlands: their scarce and precious tanks. Tanks were not something the North Vietnamese spent lightly. Every one of them had to be hauled enormous distances down the trail network, hidden from the constant threat of American air power, fed with fuel and spare parts that were even harder to move than the machines themselves. To commit armor to a single attack on a single hill was a serious decision, a sign of how badly the enemy wanted those long-range guns silenced. They had done the same calculation at Lang Vei the year before and been rewarded with a shattered camp. The logic that had worked once would surely work again. That assumption, reasonable on its face, was about to meet the one fact the enemy did not possess. The garrison at Ben Het was a patchwork, the way these camps always were. There was a Special Forces detachment of Green Berets. There were several hundred Highland strikers of the civilian Irregular Defense Group, the same kind of fighters who had stood at Lang Vei. There were South Vietnamese Special Forces and a number of South Vietnamese regular soldiers. There were the American artillerymen serving the big guns and a pair of tracked anti-aircraft vehicles bristling with automatic cannon that were far more useful against ground troops than against planes. The Highland strikers deserve a word of their own because they did most of the dying in these camps and are too often left out of the story. They were Montagnards, the mountain peoples of the Highlands who had their own languages, their own customs, and a long history of being pushed aside by the lowland Vietnamese on both sides of the war. The Green Berets recruited them, trained them, fought beside them, and in many cases came to respect them deeply. For the Montagnards, the camps were a chance to defend their own ground and their own villages. They were the muscle of the border defense, the men who manned the wire and the bunkers in their hundreds, while a handful of Americans called in fire and held the team together. When a camp was overrun, it was usually the Highland fighters who fell in the greatest numbers. Ben Het was their hill as much as anyone's. And this time, crucially, there was armor. Someone in the 4th Infantry Division had finally made the decision that the men at Lang Fay never got to benefit from. A platoon of M48 Pattons tanks from Company B of the 1st Battalion, 69th Armour, was pushed forward to Ben Het. It was a small force, just a handful of tanks under Captain John Stovall. But it was exactly the right handful, in exactly the right place for the first time in the war. Through February, the North Vietnamese tightened their grip. They shelled the camp steadily, rockets and mortars and recoilless rifle fire walking across the hill, part of a wider push across the highlands that spring. The defenders hunkered in their bunkers and took it. Then, around the 1st of March, the shelling eased. To a tired soldier, a lull feels like mercy. To an experienced one, it feels like the held breath before something worse. The quiet was not peace, it was preparation. What Stovall did not know, what no one inside the wire could be certain of, was that the enemy had brought tanks to the edge of Ben Het. They were PT-76s, the same light amphibious machines that had broken Lang Fay, drawn from one of the North Vietnamese armoured regiments operating along the border. They had been hauled and driven down the trails to do one job: to smash into the camp, destroy those long-range guns, and prove once again that no American outpost on the frontier was safe from armour. Their crews had every reason to expect the same easy victory their comrades had won the year before. As far as they knew, Ben Het was just another hilltop full of riflemen. They did not know about the Pattons. The American tanks had arrived recently. They were dug into firing positions, hull down behind earth, their low shapes lost against the dark mass of the hill. From the jungle below, the camp looked exactly like every other border post the North Vietnamese had overrun. That single piece of ignorance, the enemy not knowing what waited on the hill, would decide everything. The first hint came the night before the battle. Stovall's platoon sergeant, a veteran named Hugh Havermale, reported that his crews could hear it again, the unmistakable clatter and rumble of tracked vehicles moving somewhere out in the blackness to the west. The sound carried for about 20 minutes, rising and falling, and then it died away. Tracks in the dark. The same sound the doomed men of Lang Fay had heard. The tankers stayed awake and waited. The next night, March 3rd, the enemy opened the attack the way they always did, with a storm of fire. A little after 9 in the evening, recoilless rifles, mortars, and artillery began hammering the camp, a heavy bombardment meant to stun the defenders and drive them down into their holes. Inside their steel hulls, the tank crews rode it out. They loaded their main guns with high-explosive anti-tank rounds, the kind designed to burn through armor. They switched on their infrared lights and peered into the green glow of their night sights, searching the tree line for movement. Then, fate, or a buried mine, lit the fuse. Somewhere out beyond the wire, roughly a kilometer southwest of the camp, one of the advancing PT-76s rolled over an anti-tank mine the defenders had planted on the approaches. The blast tore into the light tank and set it ablaze. In an instant, the burning hull became a torch on the battlefield, and its glow betrayed the others. In the flickering light, the American gunners could suddenly make out shapes, more enemy tanks, and at least one armored personnel carrier grinding forward through the brush. The crippled tank fired, and its round fell short. Other enemy vehicles opened up. Across the dark slope, muzzle flashes bloomed, each one a stab of light that marked a target. There were at least 7 of them. The first American tanker to answer was a young gunner named Frank Hembry. He could see almost nothing but those flashes in the dark, so he aimed at a flash and fired. His first round missed, he corrected, fired again, and his second round found the enemy. An enemy vehicle blew apart in the night. The battle now became a thing of flashes and shadows, fought at ranges where a mistake meant death in seconds. A patrol of Highland fighters out beyond the wire radioed that a column of vehicles, somewhere between 8 and 15 of them, was rolling toward the camp from the west. Stovall called for light. The camp's mortar crews began firing illumination rounds, parachute flares that drifted down and bathed the slope in a hard, swinging white glare. The light helped the American gunners see, but it cut both ways. It also lit the Pattons for the enemy, and now the North Vietnamese gunners could aim at something more than muzzle flashes. Consider for a moment what it took to fight a tank in that darkness. A gunner inside a Patton sat hunched over his sight, the world reduced to a narrow circle of green-tinted light or the swinging glare of a flare. He could not see a tank. He could see a flash, a brief bloom of fire where an enemy gun had spoken, already fading by the time his eye registered it. He had to guess the shape of the machine behind it, judge the range without being able to see the target clearly, lay his gun and fire all in the space of a breath. If he was right, an enemy tank died. If he was wrong, the next flash might be the one aimed at him. This was not the clean, deliberate gunnery of a training range. It was a knife fight conducted by men peering through smoke and strobing light, each side hunting the other by the fire it gave off. One of them did. As Captain Stovall climbed onto Sergeant Havermale's tank to direct the fight, an enemy round struck the Patton. The impact hit near the front of the hull, and the explosion blew both Stovall and Havermale clear of the vehicle, wounding them with shrapnel. Inside and around the tank, the cost was worse. The driver, who had climbed out to man an externally mounted machine gun, and the loader were both killed. 2 American crewmen gone in a single flash. It was the kind of moment that had unmade the defense at Langvay, the enemy armor landing a killing blow. But Ben Het was not Langvay, because the tank itself survived. The Patton was heavy and thickly armored, and the round that killed 2 of its crew left the machine itself only lightly damaged. It was not knocked out, it could still fight. A sergeant named Jones took charge in the chaos, and the crews kept their heads. A scratch crew got the wounded tank back into the fight. Jones climbed down under fire to reposition another Patton that could not bring its gun to bear from where it sat, exposing himself to the enemy to get the angle right. Once it was set, another gunner, Eddie Davis, sighted on the muzzle, flashes the way Hembry had, and destroyed another enemy vehicle. Round by round, the advantage that had existed only on paper became real on the ground. The 90mm guns of the Pattons reached out through the dark and the flare light and struck the thin-skinned enemy tanks, and where they struck, they killed. The PT-76 simply could not trade blows with the heavier machine. Its own gun could land a hit, as the dead American crewman proved, but it could not reliably destroy a Patton, while the Patton could destroy it with near certainty. The enemy crews were discovering in the worst possible way that this hilltop was different from all the others. The North Vietnamese had no good answer. They had counted on shock, on the same terror their tanks had spread at Langvay, and instead they had driven into guns that outranged and outhit them. Their attack, which had no large body of assault infantry pressing in behind it, began to come apart. As they tried to pull back, an American gunship that had come on station, an old transport plane bristling with rapid-firing guns, harassed them from above, hosing the retreat with fire. The enemy armor withdrew into the dark from which it had come. When the grey light of dawn came up over the hill, the defenders could finally see what the night had wrought. Out on the torn slope sat the wreckage of the assault. 2 PT-76 tanks were destroyed. 1 armored personnel carrier was destroyed with them. There were no enemy bodies left behind, only the leavings of a beaten force, bloody bandages, scraps of burnt clothing, a tanker's helmet lying in the dirt, an abandoned flamethrower. The North Vietnamese had dragged their dead and their survivors back into the jungle. The price for the defenders had been real but small against what it might have been. 2 American tank crewmen had died and 2 more were wounded. Among the Highland strikers, 1 was killed and 4 were hurt. A single Patton had been lightly damaged, and it was already back in service. Set that against Langvey, where an entire camp had been wiped from the map and its garrison destroyed. The difference was 4 tanks on a hill. In the cold accounting of war, 3 destroyed enemy vehicles is a small tally. But the meaning of that night ran far beyond the count of burned-out hulls. For the first time in the entire Vietnam War, an American armored unit had met enemy tanks in a stand-up fight and beaten them. Not driven them off with aircraft, not stopped them with infantry and luck, but fought tank against tank in the dark, and won. It was the first such battle American crude armor had fought since the Korean War, and in Vietnam it would be the only one of its kind. There was something almost strange about the attack, and the officers who studied it afterward noticed it at once. The enemy assault had been brief. It had come without the wave of supporting infantry that should have followed tanks into a camp. It had made no attempt to block the road from the nearby base at Dak 2, where American reinforcements would naturally come from. And it had gained nothing at all. To the men who pieced it together later, the most likely explanation was simple and telling. The North Vietnamese had not known the Pattons were there. They had planned to repeat Lang Vey against what they thought was an unarmored camp, and they had driven straight into the one thing that could destroy them. Armor was scarce and precious to them. Had they known what waited on that hill, they almost certainly would never have risked it. That single insight is the whole story in miniature. For more than a year, the fear of enemy armor had hung over the border because the Americans had not brought their own tanks forward to meet it. The moment the Pattons were finally pushed forward to a hill the enemy meant to attack, that fear was answered in a single night. The machine that ended the nightmare had been in the country the entire time. It had simply been kept away from the fight by a belief about where tanks could and could not go. The victory at Ben Het did not end the danger to the camp. It is important to be honest about that, because the tank battle was one violent night, not the end of the story. Through the late spring and into the summer of 1969, the North Vietnamese came back, this time to strangle Ben Het with a siege rather than crack it open with armor. Their regiments ringed the hill and cut the road, and for weeks the camp lived under bombardment and isolation. This time, the fight became a test of a new idea, the policy of handing more of the war to the South Vietnamese. By the middle of 1969, the American war was already turning toward the exit. The new plan was to build up the South Vietnamese forces so they could carry the burden themselves while American troops drew down. Ben Het became an early proving ground for that idea. South Vietnamese battalions, fighting alongside American-led mobile strike forces, pushed to reopen the road. It took brutal fighting much of the way, but in late June a convoy finally fought its way through from Dak 2 into Ben Het. Heavy bombers pounded the hills around the camp. By early July, the siege was judged broken. The cost over those weeks was heavy and fell most cruelly on the Highland strikers and the South Vietnamese, who bore the bulk of the dead and wounded. The camp held. The trails it watched were never truly closed. The longer story of Ben Het is not a tidy triumph. The camp endured, but the war moved on, and the years after were unkind. When the Great Conventional Offensive came in 1972, Ben Het was attacked again, this time by far heavier enemy armor than the light tanks of 1969. South Vietnamese Rangers held it for a time, knocking out attacking tanks with wire-guided missiles that had not even existed on the battlefield in '69. But in the autumn of 1972, after a massive bombardment and a concentrated assault, the camp was finally overrun. A few score survivors slipped away into the jungle. The hill that had witnessed the first American tank victory in Vietnam passed at last into enemy hands. So Ben Het was not a fortress that stood forever. It was a single, hard-won night that proved a single hard truth. And that truth outlived the camp by far. What that night proved was something armies have to relearn in every generation, usually at a terrible price. The best weapon against a tank is very often another tank. The men at Lang Vey had courage in abundance, and they had rockets and recoilless rifles, and none of it was enough, because raw bravery and light weapons cannot reliably stop 50 tons of moving steel. The men at Ben Het had something the others lacked. Not more courage, but the heavier machine, dug in and waiting, crewed by men trained to fight it at night. The difference between a camp erased and a camp held came down to that. It was not only the thickness of the armor or the size of the gun that decided it, though those mattered enormously. It was the whole system working together. It was diesel engines that did not erupt into flame at the first hit. It was infrared lights and night sights that let a gunner find a target in pitch darkness. It was the discipline to load the right ammunition and wait. The steadiness of a young gunner aiming at nothing but a flash and trusting his second round, the courage of a sergeant climbing down into the open to reposition a tank so its gun could bear. Armor plate alone wins nothing. Armor plate joined to training, optics, and nerve wins battles. There is one more thread worth pulling, because it reaches all the way to the present. The fight at Berets was, at its heart, a question. What happens when one side brings armor, the other side cannot stop? At Langvay, the answer was annihilation. At Berets, for the first time, the answer was reversed, because the defenders finally had armor of their own that the enemy could not stop. That question never really goes away. It only changes its uniform. The men who fought that night did not become famous. The young gunner who fired first into the dark, the sergeant who took over when his captain was blown off the tank, the wounded officer, and the 2 crewmen who died in the flash of an enemy round, none of them became household names. The battle was small, fought far from the cameras, in a war the country was already tired of. The detailed account that preserved it was written up by an officer of the armored battalion in a professional military journal, read mostly by other soldiers. For decades, Berets lived on as a footnote, a curiosity, the answer to a trivia question about the only American tank-against-tank battle of the Vietnam War. But footnotes can carry heavy cargo. The lesson of that hill, that you do not send men to face armor without giving them armor that the better machine kept in the rear, wins nothing. That doctrine which ignores the enemy in front of you costs lives is not a footnote at all. It is one of the oldest and most expensive lessons in the trade of arms, and it has to be paid for again and again, because each new generation is tempted to believe its own war will be different. Stop and consider how close it ran. The PT-76 that hit the mine and burst into flame did more than die. It lit the battlefield and exposed its own comrades, turning the enemy's stealth into the enemy's undoing. Had that mine not been there, had the attack come a few weeks earlier before the Pattons were pushed forward, Berets might have become a second Langvay, another camp overrun, another team destroyed, another lesson written in the wrong color of ink. The margin between disaster and victory in the Highlands that night was as thin as the timing of a few tanks arriving on a hill. The enemy who drove down those trails carried the same confidence that armor had given them at Langvay, the certainty of machines that had not yet met their match in the jungle. 4 American tanks, and the men who crewed them, took that certainty apart in the dark, round by round, flash by flash. The crews did not know, as they reloaded and fired and put out the small fires on their own decks, that they were settling a question that had hung over every border camp in the country for more than a year. They only knew that the engines were out there, and at this time they had the gun to answer them. The tanks rolled across that frontier, expecting another easy night. They found a hill that could kill them. And the difference, the whole difference between the slaughter at Langvay and the victory at Berets, was nothing more mysterious than this. Someone finally sent the right machine to the right place, in time.